Hey everyone, we're going to go ahead and get started now. Thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar. My name is John Duisberg and I am a co-founder here at Cooleaf. We're really excited to really dig in with some great speakers around some topics that are, just really top of mind and relevant for leaders right now, specifically around the topic of remote work. And working remotely is not the future, it is now. And millions of people are working from home these days. And this, as business leaders on this call, on this webinar, this presents new challenges for us, right? And one of the biggest challenges is how in this new environment do we keep employees engaged? How do we keep people connected? How do we keep motivation strong and high? And then, how does this new environment impact performance, right? And so these are questions that we've been hearing from leaders across many organizations, different types of industries, different size organizations. We're all impacted by this, right? And so we're really excited to really dig in with some great speakers today. So first up, we will have New York Times best-selling author Neel Doshi, who's going to be sharing about the research that he and his team has done specifically around employee motivation and performance. And then we're going to have Chris Koenigshof, the Vice President of Human Resources at Jackson & Coker, who's going to share about their experience making this transition to working remote and kind of some of those key lessons learned along the way. So first, I'm very pleased and excited to introduce to everyone Neel Doshi. Like I mentioned, New York Times best-selling author of the book Primed to Perform. He's co-founder of Vega Factor. Prior to co-founding Vega Factor, Neel was a partner at McKinsey and a CTO at a tech startup. So he brings just a lot of great perspective to this conversation. Neel's work has also been featured in numerous publications, including the Harvard Business Review. So we're very excited. Neel, welcome. I'm going to make you the presenter. And so you can share your screen.
Terrific, thank you.
Are you able to take the presenter, Neel?
No, not just yet.
Okay, let me try one. There you go, you got it now.
Great, thank you. Perfect. All right, everybody, let's just jump right in. I want to jump right in with a question for you guys. The question has to do with little children. So I want to share with you this experiment. Here's how the experiment plays out. Here's what the purpose of the experiment is. In this experiment, you can see this little child. This child is 1.5 years old. This child is sitting in the middle of this research room. The child was given this toy that he's using to press buttons. It lights up, it plays music. This child was given this toy specifically because of how distracting this toy is. So think about remote work, how distracted people are. This was an experiment in distracting children. Now, this child, while he's distracted by this toy, in the corner of this room, you can see this researcher sitting behind a table. The researcher and the child are total strangers to each other. They do not know each other at all. The researcher, she's minding her own business. Like you can see her right here, fiddling with a piece of paper or a clothespin. Every now and then, she will drop something off the edge of her desk. She can't reach it. She's struggling. The question is, will this child, distracted by this toy, see the problem, see the researcher in need of help, get up and help the researcher without even being asked? Now keep in mind, before you make your mental guess, this child is 1.5 years old, they are strangers, the researcher isn't asking, do you think this child distracted by this toy will see the problem and solve the problem? Take a moment, think about your guess, and let me play out for you how this actually looks. Yes, that is ridiculously adorable. But it turns out at the beginning of this experiment, practically all of the children were like the one that you just saw. So if any of you guessed that the child would not help, you should do a little bit of soul searching, because almost all of them did. Now, the point of the experiment wasn't to see would these children solve this problem. They wanted to see what can we do to inspire more of this problem-solving behavior, especially when people or children are distracted. So what they did in this experiment was they took these children, they put them into one of three research groups. The first group, when they were put into scenarios like this and they were helpful, it was just a control group. They used that first group just to measure the other two. The second group put into scenarios like this, and when they solved those problems, they were given verbal praise. Attaboy, you're a great kid, essentially to demonstrate how much we value this behavior. The third group of children were given electric shocks. I'm totally kidding. Don't write in, don't put in the chat, don't send me emails. No children were given electric shocks. I just want to make sure you're still paying attention. The third group of children were given a reward when they were helpful. So another way to demonstrate, thank you for leaving the distraction and helping us out. Now they did this for a while, then after all that training, they put them back into scenarios to see how much did that training help. And here's what they found. By the time they're done, the control group is helping 89% of the time. So that's the waterline. We'll use that to compare the other two groups. The praise group actually got a little less helpful, 81% of the time. And the reward group, significantly less helpful at solving these problems, 53% of the time. Now, as parents, this is something to think about, because praise and rewards are incredibly common strategies to get children to do things. I mean, who here hasn't tried to bribe a child into doing something? But as leaders of organizations, praise and rewards are the typical strategies used by organizations to create performance. Now, if you're seeing behavioral outcomes like this, if we're going to build high-performing organizations, we really do need to understand at a deeper level what's going on here and how do we engineer with it. Now, to really unpack this, I want to show you one last video. This video is of a child that started the day like the one that you saw the problem, did not hesitate to solve it, left their distraction behind. This child was then trained in the reward group, and here's that child at the end of this day. Yeah, that child now totally dead inside. So with that, what we're going to talk about today is the science of performance. Our research, my life's work has been around building a true deductive, predictive, quantifiable science that explains how human performance actually works. Now, to do that and to really give a crash course today on the answer to that question, I have to go through three things. The first is, what is performance? Second, what drives performance? And the third is, what scales performance? Now, to answer the first question, what is performance, I'm going to actually share a case study, a simple example that played out in the news probably about 2 years ago, maybe a year ago now. The example had to do with an amazing company, Tesla. Tesla is one of those companies where it's hard not to root for them. And when you go back in time, one of the things Tesla had to do strategically is to prove to the world that it was able to create a mass market affordable car. So think back in time, like 5 years ago, Tesla was great at building luxury vehicles, but to really demonstrate that it can grow at the pace that it needed to, it had to show that it could build a mass market affordable car. So enter the Model 3. This was a big deal for Tesla. So when you go back to May 2016, in one of their quarterly earnings calls, they announced that it is going to double its production targets for the Model 3 to 2,000 vehicles per week in 2017 and 7,500 vehicles per week in 2018. So they just announced this to the street a little less than a year before when they actually had to achieve this. Later that year, in November, Tesla buys one of the world's leaders in building factory robots. Their vision was to build the machine that builds the machine. They believed that they could create a completely automated, humanless factory. Fast forward to their next quarterly earnings call in May of 2017. They reiterate their ramping up. They actually increase their targets. They say 5,000 cars per week in 2017 and 10,000 per week in 2018. And again, 1 year after the last acquisition, they buy another leader in factory automation. Now, my hope by the end of the first section of this, you'll already see the pattern of what's probably going to go wrong. In the next quarterly earnings call, Tesla Model 3 production is now 2,000 vehicles per week, nowhere near the company's target of 5,000 vehicles per week. Why? What happened here? Well, the answer has to do with a concept called VUCA. The V in VUCA stands for volatility. It means the context and the environment we're in is constantly changing. I mean, I don't really have to tell anybody in this day and age how quickly and how rapidly context changes. How it's going to change is uncertain. It is practically unpredictable, not just big changes, but even day-to-day moments because of complexity. The world is not a linear equation. It's actually more like quasi-chaos, butterfly effects. Things interact with each other in ways that we just couldn't see coming, leaving us in a state of ambiguity. Because of VUCA, the answer to the question, what is performance, is a bit more nuanced than most executives realize. There are actually two types of performance, and Tesla's problem was they were optimizing only one of the two. The first type is called tactical performance. Tactical performance is about convergence. It's about alignment. It's about how well we stick to the plan. So automation, for example, is a driver of tactical performance. Tactical performance is, you see it all over the place. So imagine if the group of us decided to start a simple business. Maybe that business is doing telesales, like outbound telesales. Well, what would we do to maximize its tactical performance? We'd figure out what's the value proposition, what are the 5 customer segments. For each customer segment, we'd hire a psychologist, they'd write our talking script. We'd time out that script, we'd estimate the conversion rates of each call, we'd put that into an Excel spreadsheet. That spreadsheet would calculate our revenue, our costs, how many people we'd need, what the performance targets need to be. We'd operationalize all that with policy, process, procedure, scripting, QA, QC, call listening, pay for performance. All of that machinery is the machinery of tactical performance. It is about creating convergence. But there's a second type of performance. It's called adaptive performance. If tactical is about convergence, adaptive is about divergence, getting people to do different things. If tactical is alignment, adaptive is intentional misalignment, which means experimentation, trying something new. If tactical is how well we stick to the plan, adaptive is how well we don't stick to the plan. What's critical to understand as we start to really understand how do we solve for remote work, these two types of performance are definitional opposites. That's why it is so difficult to build and sustain an ultra high performing organization. You have to find a way to balance two opposing types of performance. Now, we've all seen the organizations go out of balance. So for example, every time you've called a call center and you can tell they're reading a script back to you, you're seeing an organization that doubles down on tactical at the expense of adaptive. Every time you see a project team or an engineering team that's checking all their boxes, they're hitting all their milestones, but what they're building is very ineffective. It's just not going to deliver the value proposition you need to deliver for your customer. What you're seeing is an organization that doubled down on tactical at the expense of adaptive. Vice versa, by the way, is true. I've seen organizations double down on adaptive at the expense of tactical, which means they lose scale and they result in lots and lots of arbitrary uniqueness or iterations that aren't actually approving anything. Going back to the Tesla case, this is a classic case of doubling down on tactical at the expense of adaptive. One of the financial analysts that studies and analyzes and reports on Tesla wanted to understand why is it that Tesla was missing its goals, its production targets. And here's what the analyst says. The analyst says automation simply can't deal with the complexity, inconsistencies, variation, and things gone wrong that humans can. Essentially, what this analyst is saying is tactical performance is a bad tool to deal with VUCA. In final assembly, robots can apply torque consistently, but they don't detect and account for threads that aren't straight, bolts that don't quite fit right, fasteners that don't align, or seals that have a defect. Humans are really good at this. Have you ever wondered why Teslas have wind noise problems, squeaks and rattles and bits of trim that fall off? Now you have your answer. All this analyst is saying is tactical performance is a bad tool to deal with VUCA. You need adaptive performance also. And to Tesla's credit, they learned. Elon Musk tweets out only a few months after, yes, excessive automation at Tesla was a mistake. To be precise, my mistake. Humans are underrated. Now, this is important point number one. What is performance? It's balance between tactical and adaptive. Realizing that they're opposites, how do we create the highest levels of both without one cannibalizing the other? That takes us to our second question. What drives performance? Or put differently, how do I create this balance? Now, this is something that not only have I and my colleagues been studying for decades, this is a topic that's been studied for over 150 years. I can simplify this to a very simple conclusion. Why we work determines how we work. Now, this might sound very fluffy and a bit kumbaya. I want you to realize I'm an engineer by training. This is, in fact, an engineering principle. With this principle, you can engineer a high-performing team and a high-performing organization. But in order for you to engineer it, I have to give you a way to understand why. The why is our human motives. So why does a person do something? That's their motive. Person's motive is their reason for doing something. To understand human motives, I'm going to give you a framework called the motive spectrum. This is a framework that creates clarity and helps you understand what human motives are. A person's motive can come from one of three places. There's the work or the activity or the task itself, the thing that they are doing. There is themselves, their identity, their values, what they believe in. And then there's everything else, everything separate from the work, separate from their identity. I'm going to take these three ingredients. I'm going to give you the set of human motives. The first motive is called play. This blue circle here symbolically represents the motive. You can see it is aligned with the work itself, because play is when you do an activity simply because you enjoy the activity. So for example, I really enjoy woodworking. I'm not really good at it. No one's ever going to buy it. No one's ever going to pay me for it. In fact, I spend a lot of money on this hobby. I'm not doing it because of an outcome. I'm doing it because I enjoy the activity itself, the creativity, the problem solving, the learning, the novelty. In fact, play and curiosity are inextricably linked. Play and novelty are inextricably linked. Now, to be clear, when you're trying to use play to drive performance, it is not you've given your colleague a foosball table or a ping pong table or a kombucha on tap. Play has to come from the activity itself, the work itself. The second motive is called purpose. You can see now this motive straddles the line between the person's identity and the work, because the purpose motive is you believe in the immediate outcome of your work. While play is the work itself, it's completely neutral or independent to the outcome. Purpose is you're doing something because you believe your outcome, your contribution, you matter. To be very clear here, purpose is not, we have a big mission statement that we put on the walls, we put on our screensavers. Purpose is, I am a colleague in your organization, I'm on the front lines of it maybe, or maybe I'm an engineer. I believe my contribution, and specifically my contribution, matters immediately. That's the purpose motive. The purpose motive is the exact opposite of you thinking your work doesn't matter, that you think you're fungible. The next motive is called the potential motive. Potential, the circle is now a little further to the right. It's a little further from the work, because while purpose is you're doing an activity because it immediately matters, potential is it eventually matters. Now, this is where a big mission statement might come in. This is where your own personal development might come in. It's the eventuality that separates potential from purpose. Now, all three of these motives are at least in some way anchored directly off the work itself, so they're called the direct motives, directly anchored off the work. But there are motives that are indirect, no longer connected to the work. The easiest way to understand the first of the indirect motives is ask yourself, have you ever compelled a loved one to do something using guilt? So guilt is an example of the first of the indirect motives called emotional pressure. So let's just say, hypothetically, I guilted my wife into doing something. Well, the thing I want my wife to do is the activity itself. My wife's identity, she cares about her husband. In this particular scenario, I am the external force. When an external force acts on your identity to get you to do something, it is definitionally emotional pressure. Guilt, shame, peer pressure, showing up well at work. I need to look good to my boss. I need to look good to my peers. I don't want to look like I'm incompetent to my boss's boss. All of this are examples of emotional pressure. Next up is economic pressure. Economic pressure is now perfectly aligned to the external force because economic pressure is when you're doing an activity to gain a reward or avoid a punishment. Now, when you think about work, the nature of your organizations, there's a layer that is the work itself, the thing you want your people to do. They're now your people, what they believe in and value and identify with. And then there's all of the reward and punishment layers that you put on top of that. Make no mistake, that is a layer that is separate from the work itself. And when you find that you or a colleague is doing something because of that layer, it is definitionally economic pressure. And lastly, you have inertia. Inertia, the motive is now off the page. It's because when you ask somebody, why are you doing what you're doing? And they say, I have no idea. I have no idea why I'm doing what I'm doing. I can't identify for you the source of my motive. It is inertia that is compelling me. When we study performance through the lens of these motives, there are a few critical conclusions that as leaders and engineers of high-performing organizations that is important to really understand. The first is, if I want tactical performance, I can actually use any motive to create it. I mean, definitionally, inertia creates tactical performance. I can also create tactical performance by play. But if I want to create adaptive performance, the direct motives increase it. The indirect motives destroy adaptability. Now, I want to make sure this is intuitive to you because we see this play out in our everyday lives. Put differently, when a person's under pressure, it is when they're least likely to try something new. And on the other side, if you want somebody to be engaged in their work, you have to make their work engaging. Okay. Now, this plays out in every aspect of our lives. So for example, in your relationship, significant other marriages, you run into VUCA. You have to solve problems together. People who are in their relationships for play, I have fun with each other, purpose, we're creating something important together now, potential, this is eventually leading to something important. They're much more likely to be adaptive in their marriages than people who are doing it for emotional pressure. Shame, I feel shame if I got a divorce. Economic pressure, I need my joint income to pay my Manhattan rent. Or inertia, I don't know why I'm with my wife. If you're in your relationship for direct motive reasons, you're more likely to be adaptive, which leads to greater marital happiness. And this plays out in just about every form of human behavior where you need adaptive performance. If you want your children to really learn in school, their reason for learning in school should be direct, not indirect. Using rewards or shame to drive student behavior is not going to result in learning. If you coach athletes and you want them to have grit, resilience on their field, the direct motives increase, the indirect motives decrease. And workplace engagement, direct motives increase, indirect motives decrease. The pattern is so common, we can simplify it one level further to something called total motivation. Total motivation is a pretty simple concept. I need to maximize on my team the direct motives and minimize the indirect motives. In the person's mind, imagine the seesaw. Their reason for doing the work has to be heavily weighted towards the direct, not the indirect. Total motivation is shortened to the phrase TOMO. A high TOMO team or a high TOMO organization, this is what the scale looks like. But as we're seeing teams get to remote work, what we're actually seeing is organizations getting lower and lower TOMO. The play and the purpose of getting sucked out of the jobs, instead, more micromanagement, more pressure are being added. To make this really intuitive or come alive to you, I want to help you see exactly why is it that when I lower TOMO, adaptive performance suffers. Very simple experiment was conducted. It was conducted at MIT. At MIT, a quarter of these kids have perfect math SAT scores. I mean, this is a university of math nerds. In this experiment, a group of MIT students were asked to do a bunch of math problems. Some of them were asked to stand up and do these math problems out loud in front of their classmates. And the simple act of standing up caused their ability to solve simple math problems to decrease by 32%. What you're seeing here is a pretty common phenomenon. You see it in your everyday life. It's called the distraction effect. If you have a high TOMO organization, or any organization for that matter, every single job has a component that is tactical. There is a best practice. There is a best way of doing something. There is a learning that we want to make sure we've scaled. But every single job has a component that's adaptive. Either there's a new way of doing something, there's a better technology, there's a better approach, or there's VUCA, there's an issue. There isn't a single job that does not have both. You have a high TOMO team or organization, you get the tactical, you get the adaptive. But let's say I start to add a lot of pressure to the mix, just like these MIT students standing up to do math. You get the distraction effect where they still will stand up and they'll do their best to follow the process to solve the math problem, but their ability to solve simple problems decreases with that pressure. Now, the distraction effect goes by many names across different disciplines. So I want you to play a guessing game with me. The guessing game is, what do writers call the distraction effect? What do writers call the distraction effect? The answer is writer's block. What do actors call the distraction effect? The answer is stage fright. What do athletes call the distraction effect? Well, athletes have many names for this. The yips, performance anxiety. My favorite is choking under pressure, because it really spells out exactly what's happening. When you ask a writer, an actor, or an athlete what they are experiencing when they're experiencing that writer's block, that stage fright, or choking under pressure, they'll all say the same thing. They are solving now for the expectations of their audience, not for the play and purpose of the activity. That's definitionally emotional pressure. I'm solving for what this audience thinks about me, not the joy of writing or that I believe my story is important. This is critical because this exists in the workplace too. These are three different workplaces. There's no reason to believe this doesn't show up in your workplace. And we see this happen all the time when people are under pressure to deliver. Now, we can do worse than the distraction effect. Let's say I keep increasing pressure. You get to something new. Now, if I keep increasing pressure, I want to show you a simple case example. It wasn't long ago I was asked to share this research with a B2B technology sales team. They wanted to try to turn around their performance. And so they asked me to come in and help rebuild their operating model. And in my very first moments there, I just asked them for one piece of data. I asked them for what is their revenue and margin by month. And here's what they shared with me. The revenue and margin for a B2B tech sales team. Here's January, February, March, April, May, June, July, August, September, October, November, December, and on and on and on. What you see here is a roughly 80% of the revenue is being booked in the last month of each quarter. And actually, if I were to zoom in even further, usually in the last week of every quarter, and then often at a very deep discount in margin. What you'll also notice is a secular trend of steadily decreasing margin that they were not adapting to. They weren't pivoting. They weren't changing. Now, this was a sales team that was under extreme amounts of pressure to drive their performance. Now, what you see here is the manifestation of check the box behavior. Rather than pivot, rather than experiment, rather than try something new, okay, you want me to hit my quarterly targets? I will hit my quarterly targets, even if it comes at not just a deep discount, but a steadily eroding margin. What you're seeing here is something called the cancellation effect. Let's say I keep decreasing TOMO. So there's very little direct motives, very little play and purpose, lots of pressure. You still get the tactical performance. You get check the box behavior. I'm going to solve for all the things that I have to solve for and nothing else. I'm going to solve for all the sources of pressure and that's it. Whenever you see a colleague say to you, hey, just tell me what to do and I'll do it. That's the cancellation effect. Whenever you see a colleague just checking the boxes, that's the cancellation effect. You get the tactical, you've completely lost the adaptive. I'm just checking the boxes. Now, we can do worse than the cancellation effect. What worse than the cancellation effect looks like is, I'll share with you a story. The story takes place in the 1800s in the city of Delhi. The city of Delhi at the time was run by British governors, but it was infested with these, cobras. So if your city was infested with cobras, you're going to do something about it. So what these governors did was set up a cobra bounty. And with that bounty, people started bringing in buckets of dead cobras to get paid for it. What they eventually found out was that while this program looked like a success, the local population had set up cobra farms. They were farming and raising cobras for the bounty. So of course, they're not going to pay people to farm cobras. They got rid of the bounty. The value of a cobra plummets to zero. So these farms just released the cobras into the city. City ended up with more cobras by the time they were done than when they'd started. This is literally called the cobra effect. Where Tomo is now solo, it's all about the indirect motives. You still get tactical performance. The dead cobra dashboard looking fantastic. But not only have you lost the adaptive, you replaced it with maladaptive performance. People looking for the shortest possible path to alleviate their performance. And most leaders only study the first column. They don't understand the rest of this matrix. And so their ability to solve performance problems is too narrow. So take performance problems in public education. In public education, if we only understand the first column, what are we going to do? Well, we're going to implement high pressure testing. So teachers' compensation and budgets are a function of students' grades and standardized tests. And we're going to script out a teacher's day. Here's what the teacher is going to say and do on Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Now, this, of course, is going to destroy Tomo. High pressure testing. And you're going to see distraction effects. So over half of teachers report feeling under great stress several days a week, an increase of 70% from 1985. Societally, stress levels are skyrocketing because societally, we're making companies lower and lower Tomo. The cancellation effect. I'm completely pressured to teach to the test. So you want me to teach to the test? I'll teach to the test. I'm going to check the boxes and that's it. The fluency that I've lost is the adaptive performance that great teaching requires. And the cobra effect. The cheating had been going on so long, we considered it part of our jobs. Around the country, thousands of teachers are erasing the wrong answers at student standardized tests to put in the right ones. All perfectly predictable consequence of how they're managing performance. So that takes us to the last chunk of this story. What is performance is we want tactical and adaptive. We are unwilling to let one cannibalize the other. The only way to do that is to maximize Tomo. Now, how? Well, to help you see that this is a scalable construct, I'm going to share with you some data. It's actually quite difficult to measure adaptability in real time. It's actually quite easy to measure Tomo. One of the things I recommend you do is actually check in with your teams every single week by measuring Tomo. Now, when you measure Tomo, I'm going to share you some data. So first, let's look at the airline industry. The vertical axis is customer satisfaction. The horizontal axis is employee Tomo. The direct motives increase this number. The indirect motives decrease this number. Now, take a guess. Who do you think is high and low on this chart? And what you're going to see is, one, it's easy to predict. Two, a commoditized industry. Players like Southwest and Delta have been able to create massive daylight, drives great improvements in customer satisfaction by increasing Tomo. You see this play out in brick and mortar grocery chains. Same general construct with Trader Joe and Whole Foods. You see this play out in retail banking. Wells Fargo is the lowest Tomo bank in our data set, and as a result, they were left with distraction effects. Employees feeling great stress, crying, vomiting, panic attacks, cancellation effect. The pressure was against cross-selling, so you want me to cross-sell? That's all I'm going to do. And then, of course, the Cobra effect. 3.5 million fraudulent accounts, 3 billion in fines so far, all because they built a low Tomo operating model. Now, Tomo doesn't just customer satisfaction, drives revenue too. So we implemented a high Tomo operating model in a different financial institutions retail branch network. And what you saw was a significantly greater increase in productivity, revenue over expense, simultaneous improvements in net promoter score, simultaneous improvements in cross sales, all without pressure, and by the way, all without commissions. Now this takes us to the last answer. How do you scale Tomo? Well, your operating model is what creates action in your organization. All the things that you implement to get your people to do things, all of that is your operating model. Action always requires motive. So whether you realize it or not, your operating model is in fact your motive machine. And what does this have to do with remote work? When we've analyzed Tomo of remote workers, by and large, we found a fairly significant drop in motivation when people are working from home. Now, more importantly, if you did not have a choice on where to work, that drop was extremely worse. Now, a lot of the population today is in this quadrant. They did not have a choice in where to work, and they're working from home. This is an incredibly deep drop in motivation. Now, when you look back, many companies have tried big programs to drive remote work over the last decade or two. The thing that these companies have in common is they have pulled back on remote work. The issue is your operating model has to change if you're going to keep people this motivated when they're working from home. Now, an organization's operating model exists at many levels. So the way we think about it is the 5 layers of an operating model. It starts with org-wide. A lot of organizations right now, as people go remote, are doubling down too much emphasis on mission and values. Instead, Tomo should be more local than that. Teams should each be solving fast challenges. Challenges that are interesting, spur curiosity, make sure they feel valued, important to the business, but move quickly. There should be more effort spent on teaching and upholding the rules of collaborative problem solving. This is far more important than a broad, sweeping, company-wide mission and values. As you go deeper to the operating model that governs how teams interact with teams, the from state is we've seen hybrid and remote work lead to more command and control and deeper silos. Essentially, things that were interactions that were once skip level or skip multiple levels are becoming pure chain of command and remote work. The executives are not developed on operating model leadership. The two state here is working groups should not be limited by the silos. It should be very easy for people to work cross-functionally. The organization should measure and manage problem-solving velocity and Tomo itself. Executives should be coached in operating model design. One level deeper to how teams interact with themselves, team to team or habits. Teams are doubling down on project, task, or micromanagement because of remote work. And actually more meetings, and video must always be on, which is actually quite exhausting for folks. Instead, working groups should share weekly problem-solving, challenge-oriented plans, not task-oriented. You want to learn to solve problems collaboratively and asynchronously. Fewer meetings, but meetings that are better at problem-solving. One level deeper than that, leadership skill. What we're seeing is too many leaders are operating in a way that's just hands-off. They're trying to be nice, but they're actually quite low-performing, or they're transactional. Instead, leaders have to learn how to maintain intensity without pressure through maintaining the habits of a high Tomo team. Intensity is not the same thing as pressure. In fact, we do whole courses on just that theme. How do you lead with intensity, not pressure? You want to measure Tomo weekly as part of your check-in process. And then lastly, there's a talent system. We've already known that comp driven by title promotions and ratings just is really quite low Tomo. Instead, you want to start to evolve towards algorithmic or learn to earn compensation, which puts way more of the emphasis on the individual. It solves for bias and inclusion and allows you to make titles that are not compensation driving, but are instead role or scope based. Now, the point in all this is if we're going to evolve for hybrid work, we have to understand what is performance, is tactical and adaptive. We can't build an operating model because of hybrid remote work that sacrifices adaptive for tactical. The only way to do that is you have to keep maximizing Tomo. Because remote work requires a different type of operating model, you're going to have to redesign your operating model to solve for hybrid and remote work. You need to go through each of these layers and start to do it. Now, this might sound like a lot. Our research is published. There's many articles. Our book, Primed to Perform, teaches you how to do this in gory detail. You can connect with me, email with me. I'm more than happy to walk you through how to do all this. But the point is, building a high-performing organization is now a science. It's predictive. It's quantitative. It is deductive. It's at the root cause level, which means you can actually engineer this. So very rapid crash course on a very deep topic, but I hope this helps. I'm happy to stay late on this webinar if anyone wants to ask any additional questions. If we have time at the end of this, we'll also field some questions. But guys, thank you for listening and thank you for giving me your time.
Yeah, Neel, thank you so much. Definitely went through a lot. For everyone on the call, at the bottom of the screen is a Q&A box, and there you can submit questions. And so we're going to be hanging out after the webinar concludes here, and we'll make sure that your questions are answered. Right. So thank you, Neel. Really, really appreciate that. I'm going to share my screen again with everyone. Great. So, one of the reasons, we were really excited to have Neel join us today is that we get an opportunity to work with forward-thinking organizations who are looking about ways to modernize their approach to employee engagement and building a strategy, and we're able to execute that strategy through our technology platform here at Cooleaf. And Jackson & Coker, who's part of Jackson Healthcare, is one of our great customers, right? And we wanted the opportunity for leaders on the webinar today to hear a little bit about, okay, as some of these principles have been played out into, the real work environment, going remote, making that transition, what were some of the experiences? What were some of the lessons learned? And so we're really excited to have Chris Koenigshof, the Vice President of Human Resources at Jackson & Coker, share with us today. So thanks for joining us, Chris.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah. Well, and this will be a little bit of a kind of a fireside chat, back and forth. But I thought, Chris, it might be helpful if you just take a moment just to give a little bit of background, introducing yourself and the and Jackson & Coker.
Sure. Chris Koenigshof. I'm the VP of HR for Jackson & Coker. I've been here since 2016. I've been in human resources since 1993. So I've worked for companies like Genuine Parts Company, Comcast, and Cox, almost exclusively in Atlanta. So my background is in employee relations, performance management, learning and development. And so I currently lead the employee relations, recruiting, and learning and development functions at Jackson & Coker.
Oh, that's great. That's great. So Chris, one of the things that in the recent HBR piece, the Harvard Business Review piece that Neel and his team, one of the things that they suggested, and Neel actually brought up in his presentation today, he said, for your teams to be engaged in their work, you have to make your work engaging. And that may sound like such a an obvious statement, but the real question is, well, how do you do that, right? How do you do that in the real world? Now we're in this remote working environment. So can you talk a little bit about how you have focused on professional personal development, making work engaging, specifically when we're in this environment now with distributed teams?
Sure. Just to give you some background, so we, as you can tell, if you know much about Jackson Healthcare, we are very focused on our associates. We have been named a best employer for numerous times. So we do a lot of surveying. So the surveys that came out last few years, people have asked for more work from home opportunities. They've also asked for more recognition opportunities. So that's really why we're sitting here today. So we released Cooleaf last year. We started using that. And then this year, beginning of this year, our associates had asked to work from home more. So by the end of last year, we had gotten everybody laptops and they were able to work from home. So fortunately for us with COVID coming out, that worked out really well. So if there's a lesson, it's listen to your associates, right? But so we really, when we started looking at what we were looking for from Cooleaf, we were looking for three different things. We were looking for a system that provides recognition, one that provides ownership, a sense of ownership, and a sense of community for our associates. So the recognition piece, I'll talk about that in a little bit, but has really been outstanding. So we're releasing something called OKRs, if you're familiar with that. Recognition is a big piece of OKRs. So we feel like we're in good alignment with that. We've got some good facilities for that. the biggest part, I think, is the sense of community. So one of our issues that we've had is if you're in a sales environment, you've got this constant clash sometimes with sales and sales support. And so what we were trying to do with Cooleaf and being able to engage people is really connect one another, those people on a personal level. So we did challenges like having coffee with one another, doing things like sharing something about themselves to really get people to have a personal connection with others in the environment besides just their work group. So that's really been helpful for us. Really connecting people and saying thanks has been a really nice thing for us.
Yeah, Chris, you mentioned the challenges, kind of the team competitions, and the idea of the community, right? And so I know that you and I and our teams collaborated when COVID really hit and everyone was remote, not by choice. Going back to Neel's matrix. One of the things that was really interesting is that we got to come together and come up with creative ideas about how we still create that sense of community, right? And this concept of mini challenges and competitions, where it could be as simple as having a virtual coffee or sharing a home workplace, photo, right? So we got some really interesting feedback and positive momentum around the community aspect from those challenges. And it was great to work with you on that. But going into the next question, I wanted to just kind of drill down a little bit further around this idea of how do you reinforce the importance of keeping your team motivated and engaged, but doing it in a positive way. So I wanted to kind of get your thoughts on that, the positive reinforcement. How do you keep that important in keeping your team motivated?
Yeah, that's a great question. I was just kind of looking through our statistics recently, and I think I think as leaders, we all want to recognize and provide positive reinforcement. We're just so busy. I think a lot of times we miss it sometimes, but who doesn't miss it are our peers. So I was looking through our stats. So we released Cooleaf in February of 2019. To date, we've had 16,590 pieces of recognition. So our system, we recognize things like birthdays, things like that as well, service, but almost entirely. So I just pulled some additional stats. 11,256 had no monetary value to them or for a dollar. And those are peer to peer. So, what we see by that, I was looking through I think yesterday, the day before, there were 5 or 6 pieces of recognition alone. And that's kind of standard for us. We might have 5 to 10 pieces of recognition a day. So there are things like, thanks for helping me out, for training me yesterday. Thanks for stepping in while I was out. Thanks for being an amazing mentor. So what we see are that people are reinforcing our behaviors, our behaviors and our values. One of our values and one that we live by is others first. And so what's really cool about this system is we've been able to reinforce the behaviors that we feel are positive. And so that's really been a good thing. Again, as much as we try as leaders, it's really hard to do the praising that you get when you have a system that's more peer-to-peer. That's worked really, really well for us.
Yeah, really, really interesting to hear those stats, Chris. And final question, and then we will transition into the Q&A. And I see some questions coming in, which is great, and we'll make sure we answer all of those. So I know that that part of the values with Jackson and Coker, and part of the ways that I know you share with me about keeping engagement strong is this idea of giving back, right? And especially during this time where we are in a very difficult time. And so talk a little bit about how you made this part of your strategy, and just how you've enabled your teams to give back during this time.
right? If you know much about Jackson Coke or really Jackson Healthcare, we are a very altruistic company. We do a lot in the communities. Our founders, that's really you know, kind of our backbone. So you know, this pandemic has really been interesting for us. Again, it's allowed us, the work from home has been an issue, but we've really been able to maintain our community by focusing on people other than ourselves. So normally we do like, there's some different rewards we have out, Make-A-Wish, ASPCA. We allow people to, of course, donate any of the funds that they want to. Oddly enough, so we had some of our, so if our business is basically, we work with clients like hospitals and healthcare organizations, and we match them with healthcare providers. And so we have a lot of really good relationships with healthcare providers. So some of our sales folks on the healthcare provider side, you know, are very close, and they started buying people, our healthcare providers, lunches, breakfast, dinner. And so it was pretty cool. So they had started that. And then John had come to me and said, hey, we want to help with Feed the Need Atlanta. Would you guys want to participate? And that fits so well in with what we do. So they were buying meals for local restaurants for healthcare providers, which is exactly what we do. So that actually worked out really well. I think we had 50 people donate some points, which turns into a monetary value. And I think there was about $8,000 or $9,000 in that was total. So that was a nice thing. And again, it fit really nicely in with our core values of others first.
Yeah, no, that's awesome, Chris. And, you know, really cool, you know, how, you know, just the whole concept around using this challenge tactic, right, to bring people together, to increase engagement and do it in a way, you know, that's meaningful and benefiting the community. And so this picture here is actually Children's Healthcare of Atlanta, where meals were donated based on donations from employees participating in these challenges. Which was just a great story to see. And then this picture gets then shared, you know, with Jackson and Coke, all employees, so they get to see the direct benefit that they're making in the community. Yeah, thank you, Chris, for walking us through just a couple real world examples. So I wanted to share, just as a thank you for everyone's time, and participating on our webinar today, we're going to be raffling away 10 copies of Prime to Perform. And so we'll be following up with folks for attendees after today's webinar with that copy. We'll also be including the opportunity, if desired, we'll share through a consultation, free consultation, about best practices related to engagement strategies. But this is something we just wanted to do as a thank you. And so we'll be sending those out to folks and letting you know for the raffle winners after the webinar today. And with that being said, I want to open this up to Q&A. And so we're gonna get started. And thank you both, Chris and Neel, for sticking around for our Q&A session here. For anyone who still has a question, please go ahead and submit it through the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen. And I am going to start with the first question. So one question we have here, this goes to Neel. So I think, you know, some of the, and this was actually, I think a couple questions was related to this, but so Neel, one of the, you know, one of the things that we see from, and this specifically from Manu, was, you know, a lot of the Silicon Valley companies, Wall Street companies, you know, kind of companies across the board, you know, they design, you know, their performance management systems on rewards. And so, you know, why is that? And, you know, how does that conflict with your research? What are your thoughts on rewards? And just, you know, maybe some context or some commentary around that, Neel.
Yeah, it's a great question, Manu. I mean, the very fast answer is they just didn't know. I mean, there's inertia. A lot of inertia drives choices on how organizations set up their operating models. Like, why are we structured this way? Well, I hired an executive and he made an org chart, and that's why we're structured this way. Why do we have this performance management system? It was the default system in Workday. I mean, that's literally answers that I've heard from executives around the world. Now, right now, I'm personally engaged with a number of tech companies in Silicon Valley. I'll tell you one of them, big tech company. They've grown up really quite rapidly. They have offices around the world. And I was talking to their CEO. The CEO says, "Hey, Neel, I think we have a real engagement problem. I'm looking at our surveys, and I'm kind of seeing it." And I said, "Let me just guess the first thing. Your lowest engagement office is San Francisco." He said, "How do you know?" Because unfortunately, a lot of the operating models of tech companies in Silicon Valley are very low TOMA. Their retention levels are worse because of it. Their ability to actually engage their people is worse because of it. And so the short answer to your question is they didn't actually know better, and they're feeling the pain of it very deeply. Unfortunately, not a lot of organizations know what we just went through today, so they don't realize there is, in fact, a cure to that pain.
Got it. Thanks, Neel. So the next question comes from Pamela. Pamela, and this is, Neel, this is going back to part of your presentation where you talked about managing with intensity and not pressure. The question is just, can you kind of elaborate a little bit more on that? How do you do that and make sure that it's intensity but not pressure? Where's that balance?
Totally. It's a great question. And Pamela, you had that question. I also think, Safi, you had the same question later on, so we'll just cover both of them at once. I'll give you two examples, then I'll give you kind of a very easy thing to do, and I'll give you a slightly harder thing to do. Example one, I was talking to the head of product of a big tech company not long ago. And she tells me that the engineering team, or 1,000-person engineering team last year produced very little output. And so the first thing I asked her was, well, what did you say to them? And she said, I didn't say anything to them. Going back to Manu's question earlier, she's like, I didn't say anything to them because, you know, we're in Silicon Valley, and I'm afraid if I were to say something, they'd all just pick up and leave because these guys are getting calls every single day. I said, you realize by saying nothing, you simultaneously signal to them that their work doesn't matter. Now, this is the first time anyone's ever coached this executive to think that way, that there's a difference between helping somebody see that it really matters, and there's a difference between that and pressure. I'll give you another example. I'll often ask people, give me an example when you're the most motivated, or when you've been the most motivated in your work. Oftentimes people will say to me, I had a deadline. And I'll say to them, well, what did the deadline do? Like, how did the deadline affect your motives? And I'll usually kind of frame two options. Option A is that deadline made you feel afraid. Like, it made you feel like you're going to get penalized by your boss or your boss's boss. You might lose your job. Or that deadline made you feel like that work really mattered. And you had the degrees of freedom to problem solve within that constraint. 99% of the time, people say it was the second one. Now, this is a trick here, because something like a deadline, someone who's just learning this research might say, oh, Neel, deadline must be low TOMA. Not really. A deadline that signals that it matters, where you have the ability to quote unquote play or problem solve within the constraint, actually increases TOMA. As long as constraints actually make games more fun, not less fun. But deadlines that are about looking good, not getting punished, not losing your job, well, that decreases TOMA. What you're seeing in this pattern is the difference between intensity and not pressure. Here's the very simple thing I'd suggest you guys to do if you want to actually really master this, is first, share what you've learned here with your teams and let them know that you are going to try to practice being a high TOMA leader. Just let them know what that means and let them know that you're trying to practice. And then every week in your check-in, measure their TOMA. Because what you'll find is they'll start to tell you if you're accidentally doing something that's low TOMA. That's the easiest thing. Like, I have my colleagues, I literally wrote a book on this topic. My colleagues still tell me, Neel, that thing you just did was low TOMA. And that's fantastic, because it means I'm not walking on eggshells. It means I can experiment. It means they're not going to take it the wrong way. Now, the harder thing, which kind of gets really at the heart of Safi, your question, is the easiest way to create intensity without pressure is to maintain good rhythms in your team, tight rhythms that are not focused on tasks, but are focused on challenges and problem solving. A fast rhythm around problem solving starts to create this intensity that signals it's fun to solve a problem. There's a lot of curiosity, there's a lot of things to do. It signals that your work really matters. But as long as that problem solving is truly collaborative, that you're solving the problem together, not judging people on their outcomes, it reduces pressure. Now, Safi's right, this is actually a topic in and of itself, but hopefully that gives you some fast thoughts.
That's great. Thanks, Neel. So we're gonna keep going through some of these questions. So Andrew had a question related to the findings that your research has resulted in. Are there differences? Do the findings apply to different national cultures? Is there differences?
It's a great question. So Andrew, the way to think about this is, one, you want to really separate in your mind two different issues. Issue one is, how do motives drive performance? And issue two is, when people are asked what motives they prefer, what do they say? Those are actually totally different. The way motives drive performance is human. It's actually, regardless of culture, and honestly, it's actually logical, that the indirect motives focus you on solving the indirect motives, not the work. The direct motives focus you on solving the work. And as a result, you do that work better. Put differently, when the motive and the work are one and the same, you can focus on one thing. As the motive gets further and further away from the work, you have to increasingly focus on two things. And once the motive becomes overwhelmingly powerful and separate from the work, that's all you focus on. So the connection between motive and performance, you can get there from pure logic. That is how deeply human it is. But the second question, which is, when you ask somebody, what motive do you prefer, you get all sorts of different answers depending on macro cultures, micro cultures, like within organizations or within teams, across generations. The issue is, a lot of organizations, they think the way to build a culture is to ask people what they want. That's not the right answer. If you want to build a high-performing organization, a high-performing culture, the only way is through TOMO, and that is, in fact, universal.
Got it. So, one question I wanted to make sure that we had time for, because you mentioned it a few times, Neel. So you mentioned, if you're doing those one-on-ones as a manager, for example, to measure TOMO. So the question is, well, how do you measure TOMO effectively?
There's a bunch of ways. Depends on what you're trying to do. There's one way that we just offer in the book, like the questions, the whole methodology, 6 questions, 1 for each motive, simple math. You can see in the book, there's an HBR article that I think we can share out with after this that also describes how to measure TOMO. That's one way. The way that we prefer actually is different, is a little bit different than that. What I do in my own teams is every week we do a check-in. In that check-in, we measure TOMO, but we measure it in a much more micro way. What we're essentially asking our colleagues when they check in every week is, as you're anticipating the week ahead of you, do you anticipate there being enough play, purpose, and potential? And do you anticipate there not being emotional pressure, economic pressure, and inertia? The reason why we actually do that inside our own company, which is different than what we put in the book, is what we're signaling to our colleagues is, you own this. I don't own your TOMO, you own your TOMO. And we all have to work together to actually maximize the TOMO of our teams. If you like, one of the resources that I think Cooleaf will send out is a link to our free measurement tools where you can actually measure this yourself.
Great. Yeah, absolutely. So for everyone on the call, we, after the webinar today, we're going to send out a copy of the slides. We're going to send out resources that Neel has referenced here as well. So just know that you're going to receive all of those resources post the webinar here. But we'll keep going. And appreciate Neel, your time, and Chris, of course, as well. Bernita has a question, and this is, what can you do when your team is being led towards the Cobra effect by your leader?
That's a really tough question. There's a lot of context underneath that question. I'm sure that context actually really matters. But I'll tell you what my general playbook is. So I'll tell you, about a year ago, I got a call. It was a Sunday morning. I remember this moment vividly. I was having my morning coffee. I pick up my phone, and the voice on the other end, she says, I pick up the phone. She says, "Neel, I hate you." And I'm like, okay, tell me why. I knew who it was because caller ID. She said, "I just started my new job." She became the CEO of this tech company. And she says, "Because I learned what you teach, I can't not see the Cobra effect." The first thing I do in an organization when we start to drive a transformation is I teach them this research, and I help them realize that something like a Cobra effect is not because this person's a bad person. If you think about the Cobra effect at Wells Fargo, for example, or the Cobra effect of teachers erasing wrong answers on students' test papers, these aren't bad people. These are predictable consequences of the system around them. By starting with that teaching and making us all realize, well, one, the system creates these outcomes, and two, we can engineer that system, it becomes a lot safer to talk about Cobra effects. It doesn't feel like—
lost you there.
Oh, I'm sorry. Can you hear me?
Not able to hear you.
How about now?
We can hear you now.
I'm sorry. How long ago? It was a very impassioned speech.
Just about 5 to 10 seconds.
So what else? The short story of it, Bernetta, is I start by just teaching this research and making it very safe to say that our system is causing a Cobra effect without anyone feeling like they're being personally blamed for it. So hopefully that helps, but I get your context is probably very nuanced.
Got it. Neel, we'll wrap up here with maybe one more question, and I wanted to just assure everyone, if it's okay with you, Neel, we will allow people to reach out to you with additional questions. I think that this topic is just really, really relevant to a lot of leaders here, and there's just so much good content to cover, and just how we can apply it. And so, we have a question. Manu wrote in, so what are some straightforward, simple and actionable best practices as a manager, a mid-level manager, that I can do to increase motivation with my team each Monday morning, each week? And so I guess this kind of, thinking about how do I make this actionable? How do I take away something I can just start applying? And I know you mentioned just let your team know that you're trying to practice TOMA, but any other advice, tips? What are some actionable steps that I can take and apply, tomorrow?
Yeah, totally. So Manu, every team's a bit different, so I'm gonna give you kind of a broad answer. Here's where I start with an organization usually. Step one, teach the research. That, by the way, goes a long way. So take what you learned here, share it with your team. You can use the articles, you can use the book. There's many tools on this, but step one, just teach it to your team. That already goes a long way. Put differently, once they know you're trying to solve for their TOMA, that alone will give you a fairly big boost in their TOMA. But they have to know that you're trying. The second thing is, that's thing number one. Thing number two is going back to thing number one, that's also why we measure it every week, because that weekly check-in lets them see we're trying. And even if you did nothing, that showing them that you cared and showing that you're trying, it gave you a pretty big boost. The second thing, as you mentioned, what can I do every Monday, every week? What we recommend to most team leaders is lay out for the week the challenges or the problems that the team should be solving. If you can avoid it, try to avoid giving them the answers. Sometimes you can't, by the way. Let's be realistic. Sometimes you can't avoid it. But when you can avoid it, make sure that they feel like they are part of the process of solving those problems. You're not giving them a task list. You're laying out problems, you're laying out challenges, you're challenging them to solve those challenges, you're nudging them along the way. You're minimizing giving them tasks or answers, and you do that every single week. And those problems should be important. They should matter. They should be driving your team forward. They should be creating more customer impact. If you just get into that rhythm, you will solve for half of TOMA. There's, of course, a bunch of other things, but I'd suggest start with those two. They'll take you a long way.
That's great. That's great. Yeah. Thank you, Neel, for just sticking around and sharing, the level of insights. Thank you for all the participants for providing great questions. We are going to be sending out resources to everyone, as well as, obviously you can have the ability to reach out to Neel to answer more specific questions as well. This is such a, relevant topic for us all. So, really want to just say thank you both to our speakers. Neel, really appreciate all your insight, your research, your feedback, your answers to the questions, and Chris, for the real world experience that you can share and the lessons learned that you were able to talk about as well. So thank you everyone for your time today, and we will be following up with you with these resources.
Thank you, guys.